Welcome to the Macmillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Helen Siu, a professor of anthropology. Her teaching interests are political and historical anthropology and urban and global culture change. For the past 4 decades, Professor Siu has explored the nature of the socialist state and the refashioning of identities in South China. More recently, she is researching the rural-urban divide in China, cross-border dynamics in Hong Kong, and historical and contemporary Asian connections. Today, we'll talk with Professor Siu about China's urban revolution. Welcome, Professor Siu.
Yeah, thank you.
You have spent a good number of years doing research in China. Let's begin with an overview of the work that you've done.
Wow, 40 years.
Yes.
I started working on China in the mid-70s when I was a graduate student. China, of course, is a constantly moving target.
Sure.
In the 70s, I was in the countryside studying the impact of the rural revolution. In the 80s, when the Chinese government decided to liberalize its economy, I followed a lot of the young migrant workers into the market towns and to study, basically to explore the development of redevelopment of trade, the rising of the small-scale enterprises, and then the refashioning of cultural identities. But by the 90s, the government was privatizing the urban economy and housing and allowed huge numbers of rural migrants into the cities to look for work. And so I followed the 100 million plus rural migrants into the Chinese cities. And you actually see the urban landscape changing together with a rising urban middle class consumers. And so today, I went further and followed and have been following the very adventurous entrepreneurs in China to the Middle East and to Africa, because they have been responding to the call of the Chinese government to go out to the world, so to speak. So in a sense, to summarize, I mean, these 40 years, to me, China is a moving target, and I study China not as a place, but as a process. So wherever, at certain crucial historical junctures, when, certain cultural, political dynamics, have been exciting, that's where I have been.
Let's talk about some of the major changes you've been able to witness over the course of those 40 years.
Oh, the major changes? Well, if I have to say, in the 70s, when I went to China in the mid-70s, everything was red, but life was colorless.
And by red, you mean communist?
Politically,
red. Yes.
It was the height of the Maoist period. And so it was then very bare. I mean, life was bare, colorless. But of course, today, after 35, 40 years of economic reforms, things have changed a lot. And you can see a whole country just on the fast-forward mode. Everybody's just desperately trying to catch up with the world after decades of deprivation, material deprivation. But you also see some very conflicting sentiments.
Like what?
You see very lingering feelings of lingering socialist entitlements, but coupled with some firm belief in the survival of the fittest, and also a belief in this sort of naked market forces. So you see a lot of these things happening all at the same time. But life is extremely fast-paced at this point.
Is there still a sense of that redness that you spoke of earlier?
It surely is, and I've written on it quite a bit since the mid-90s, actually, because the redness actually hasn't been, I would say, it's lingering. It's lingering, and I think it has to do with several generations of Chinese citizens having internalized the power of the state. And so you still see the state very, very dominant in everyday life.
Right.
And so, and it affects people, even people who are so determined to put the revolution behind them. And yet, the moment they open their mouths is still the language of the state.
Very
so I call that state involution.
Okay.
So.
And how about surprises? Have you come across any surprises over the course of your work there? Anything you said, wow, I didn't see that coming, or?
Well, surprises, not really, but paradoxes, yes.
Okay, let's talk about that.
And since we're going to talk about the urban revolution, so I'll pick that as an example. Of course, today, the whole world would see that China's cities are just booming everywhere. Of course, you have ghost cities, 100 of them or whatever. But for most of the very important cities, particularly along the coast, you see things thriving. And the intensity, the scale, and the audacity of city building means that in China, many of these cities are running out of space. The officials, for their vanity or whatever, are building landmarks, spectacular landmarks and infrastructure. The rising middle class are also, looking for space for their gated communities, for shopping malls, for parks, for museums, whatever, to build up their cultural capital. Migrants flooding into the cities, as I said, there's 100 million plus. People working in factories, working in markets, and building infrastructure, they are sort of cramped in these cheap housing at the margins. Then, if the cities are spreading, they have to spread somewhere.
Right.
And so the villages on the edges, on the margins of these cities, are facing an urban tsunami.
So there are still villages versus towns and cities that we would call here. There's quite a disparity between the two.
Yes, because particularly, villages are basically from the Maoist revolution days.
Wow.
The villages are collectives. And so what's happening with this rural-urban interface at this point, when cities are spreading, is that you see the villages trying to protect themselves. Now the city officials particularly, would look at these villages as, primitive, backward, dirty, or even, chaotic, illegible. And so they would target a lot of these villages for demolition.
Even though that was part of their history, it's interesting to me.
Oh yeah, because the city officials, they're desperate to have space, because real estate and land development now has become the major source of their budget. And so they have to expand. But that's the only way to expand, right? And so what happened is that the villages, even though they're being targeted as these urban enclaves, surrounded by malls and gated communities and whatever, they dig in their heels and they cling onto their rural statuses, they cling onto their cultural traditions, village cultural traditions, and they are bargaining for state compensations, and they're also gaming the big-time real estate. So in a sense, you see that these tensions, very hotly contested areas in this rural-urban divide, and so long as cities are expanding outwards, I think these volatilities are going to continue for a while.
So are there any major violent kinds of uprisings?
Yes. We just don't hear it in the media as much.
I was going to say, I haven't heard anything about that.
Even mainstream Western media has been reporting, from New York Times to The Guardian to all over the world. But you pick a lot of that from the blogs and from sort of news channels that's gone over the firewall of the Chinese media czars. So there's a lot of them.
Yeah. So earlier you had mentioned following Chinese out into the world in Africa and the Middle East.
Africa.
So currently it strikes me as there's a bit of a, I call it a scramble for Africa, harkening back to the colonial scramble for Africa taking place there now. I'm curious to know your perceptions of how China is shaping Africa, for instance.
It's a very, very hot topic, China-Africa today. Well, a few years ago, as I was studying the urban village enclaves in Guangzhou, or Canton, you know, in the old name, I was already noticing a large number of West African traders in Guangzhou. All class, you know, they all living in these cheap housing in these urban villages, and I was wondering who they were. They're basically West Africans from Nigeria, Ghana, Ivory Coast, Senegal, Mali, even Angola. And they're Francophone, Anglophone, they're Muslims and they're Christians. And at the height of it, even in one city alone in Guangzhou, there's like about, I was told, about 100,000 of them. So I mean, it's a huge number within the city space. And so I was wondering what's happening. But of course, in Hong Kong, there's always been the Chongqing Mansion, the infamous Chongqing Mansion, where all these African traders were trading and ordering goods to be sold back to Africa. So it's kind of a low-end globalization, according to a colleague of mine, Gordon Matthews. Anyway, and so as I was just noticing that, my colleagues who worked on Africa have also been noticing that there's Chinese everywhere in the African continent. So we decided, you know, Mike McGovern, and a junior colleague of mine at the time, and we decided to form a small research cluster with our PhD students, and then we went to China to take a look. So we went to Guangzhou, we went to Yiwu, south of Shanghai, to see where these Africans and Arab traders too, you know, have been congregating. And then last year we also went to Tanzania and Zanzibar. So in a sense, we're trying to understand what's happening on the ground. And for anthropologists and historians, we are particularly trained to capture with knowledge, local knowledge, with languages, and with, you know, our observations on the ground. We hope to cut through, or cut away maybe, the kind of geopolitical polemics to portray China either as friend or as colonizer. So we really need that kind of sophisticated, you know, nuanced local knowledge, and that's what we do best.
So what are you finding from the work you're doing in Africa? How have the Chinese affected Africa in any substantial way?
Well, I think in 2008 or 2009, I forgot, one of these years, China already overtook the US as the biggest investor in the continent. So the investment is huge.
And do you know what they're investing in particularly?
Yeah, mainly infrastructure. I mean, the Chinese are building everything. I mean, roads, ports, airports, railroads, houses, everything. But it's still very much hardware. Relatively less has been done in building up software for human or social development. If you see the supposedly 1 million Chinese workers there already in the continent, I was told there's 1 million. I don't have the figures, but you know, at least you see them everywhere. But then they are very much living in company camps, and their interaction with local society is quite minimal.
That's what I was going to ask you, if there was any
minimal
interaction.
Yeah,
so basically they keep them to
they
themselves.
keep to themselves. I mean, they even grow their own food. I mean, this is really quite surprising. And of course, language is a barrier.
Of course,
their salaries aren't even paid there. Their salaries are paid via banks in their home, you know, villages or towns in China. And so that kind of cultural barrier, you know, I think whenever, you know, these kind of misunderstandings can really become very politicized. So that's
So it strikes me as it might be a very good opportunity for some Chinese, especially the people on the fringes, to go to Africa for a better job, per se? Or is that what you're finding?
I think, I have a doctoral student who just finished her dissertation on migrants' children. That is already a younger generation of migrant workers, beyond, their parents' generation who contributed to China as world factory. Now, I can see that a younger generation of more adventurous migrant workers are going abroad and trying to find a new livelihood. So it's, but the problem still is that they are keeping to themselves, and they're coming from particular regions. So it's quite structured.
Yeah, that's interesting. Let's move on to the new work you are embarking on, the Interracia initiative, with the generous funding you received from the Carnegie Corporation. Give us an overview of what you're doing with that project and what you hope to accomplish.
Yeah, I think, well, that's just another intellectual baby of mine, I suppose. I have to backtrack a little bit just to give a context.
Sure.
About 12 years ago, I was, I finished chairing the East Asian Council and doing other things. And I was already noticing, even then, that's in the late 1990s, I already noticed that the center of gravity of Asian studies was moving to Asia. And so I figured that we need a base there.
Okay.
I mean, of course, it's been monopolized by the US and Europe quite a bit in terms of Asian studies. But so I set up an interdisciplinary and interregional research institute there. It's a very modest little thing, but it's creative, it's strategic. I always think of it as a mini. It's small, it's flexible, it's strategic, but it has a BMW engine, right? So, but anyway, and so I started that, and by, for a long time we were focusing on training up postgraduate students and also exposing our junior faculty to things Asia. But by 2006, I was already noticing that the whole world was being sucked into China. So I decided to take all our critical mass and move the opposite direction. And so we started this Interracia agenda. So quite a bit, ahead, I would say quite a bit ahead of some of our peers. And at the same time, SSRC, that is Social Science Research Council, which remains a very, very core partner here, they organized a big conference in Dubai, 2008. And from then on, we are hooked. We have a very good partnership with them, with National Singapore University, and then also with the Hong Kong Institute for Humanities and Social Sciences, which I established 12 years ago in Hong Kong. And so the three of us have been holding conferences, creating Inter-Asia focus. Macmillan Center came in here, Ian Shapiro and Nancy Ruther kindly gave me a little bit of seed money to keep Yale in the picture. But most of the funds came from, the three partners. So we've been working on that, and we had conferences, Dubai 2008, and then Singapore 2010, and Hong Kong 2012. And then this coming fall, we're going to have another one in Istanbul.
And what will that?
Interasia, about 6 to 8 sort of simultaneous panels, each having about 12 speakers and paper givers, and we solicited paper proposals all over the world. I mean, it's a tremendous network, and every time we get about 80 to 100, 120 even participants.
That's
so
wonderful.
You really see a critical community growing with a certain agenda to do two things. One, to rethink the land-based, state-centered, rather static social science paradigms and to rethink that, and then converting that into processes, processes over land, sea, air, and even cyberspace. And so we are rethinking regional studies, we're rethinking globalization in historical and contemporary terms.
Okay.
And so it's growing, and now with the Carnegie Fund coming in this year, we are actually creating more digital networks, and we are turning our attention to curriculum building and also teaching and the training of postdocs. And so hopefully with all the partners coming in, and Yale now being one of our core partners in this venture, we will hope that more people will join us. And we run all of this with a very small budget. Most of the funds, for these interracial research clusters are still being funded by my institute in Hong Kong, but we are getting, funds elsewhere, and
so there's more and more interest.
Yeah, and the interest, just like the China-Africa venture, I mean, the interest has been quite overwhelming. I mean, nicely overwhelming. But we've done it with a shoestring budget, but with lots and lots of goodwill and lots of team spirit.
Okay.
So I think that's what we do.
So we have more to look forward to through that project.
Yeah, I hope so.
Okay.
Hope so.
Well, thank you so much for being here today and sharing some of your work.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much for inviting me.
For more information about Professor Siu and her research, please visit our website at yale.edu/Macmillan Report. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the Macmillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.